I never considered myself an experienced hiker, but I loved getting out into the bush. Living in the city, the constant noise, the pressure, and the long hours at work were always gnawing at me. I'd read somewhere that nature, even just walking through it, could do wonders for your mental state, and it seemed like the perfect way to unwind after a long week. So, when I woke up on that Saturday morning, feeling the weight of the past week's stress hanging over me, I figured a nice walk in the woods would be just what I needed. I didn't think too much about it, really. I was more focused on just getting out there and finding some peace. I didn't even check the weather. Honestly, I didn't think it'd be a big deal. I had my water bottle, a couple of snacks, and I had been down this particular trail a few times before. I knew it led to a nice waterfall, something I could sit by and just let my thoughts drift away. I figured I'd be back home by early afternoon, feeling refreshed and ready to tackle the week ahead. I drove out to the trailhead, parked my car, and set off. The air was thick with humidity as soon as I stepped onto the path. It was hot already, but I figured it would cool down in the forest. It usually did. The sun was already up high, but I didn't think much of it. I'd been out in the bush before, and it was always good to get some exercise. The trail started off pretty easy, winding through some tall trees and thick undergrowth. Birds were chirping, and there was a soft breeze rustling the leaves. It was calming at first, but the deeper I went into the bush, the more I realized how sweltering it was. By the time I reached the point where the trail began to descend, I could feel sweat dripping down the back of my neck, soaking through my shirt. I should have turned around then, but no. I kept going, convinced the waterfall wasn't far ahead. The trail steepened as I went, and the sun felt like it was just hammering down on me. The heat, combined with the humidity, made it feel like I was walking through thick soup. Still, I pushed on. The hill dropped sharply as I neared the bottom, and the path became more overgrown. The ground was uneven, with loose rocks and roots sticking up out of the dirt. I nearly slipped a couple of times, but I kept my footing. I didn't want to lose my balance halfway down the hill. I was starting to feel that familiar burning sensation in my legs, the kind you get after too much exertion in the heat, but I kept going. Finally, I reached the bottom of the hill and found myself in a small clearing. A few bushes and shrubs were scattered around, and the air was thick and still. The heat hit me harder here, and there was no breeze to help cool me down. I wiped my forehead and looked around. The waterfall was nowhere to be seen. I knew the trail went this way, but maybe I had misjudged the distance. Maybe it wasn't as close as I had thought. At that point, I was done. My body was begging for a break, and my head was foggy from the heat. I found a shaded spot under a large tree and sat down to rest. I pulled out my lunch, a simple sandwich, and opened my water bottle. The water tasted lukewarm, but it was refreshing nonetheless. I took a few sips and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I had only packed enough for a short walk, and now I was too far in to be comfortable turning back just yet. I'd sit here for a while, smoke a joint to relax, and then head back. I leaned back against the tree, closed my eyes, and let the sounds of the bush surround me. It was peaceful at first, but as the minutes dragged on, I began to feel the weight of my situation. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how hot it was, how tired I felt, and how far away my car seemed. I glanced at my watch, 11:45 a.m. Great, it wasn't even midday yet, and I was already too wiped out to think straight. But the idea of heading back up the hill was daunting. I wasn't sure I had enough energy to make it back up, and the last thing I wanted was to risk overheating halfway up that steep incline. I tried to put it out of my mind and decided to eat the muesli bar I had left, along with the apple. Maybe the energy would help. The heat, however, seemed to sap it all away instantly. I drank more water, but it didn't seem to be enough. I felt like I needed a gallon of cold water, not just a few sips here and there. As I sat there, still trying to gather the will to get up, I noticed something odd in the corner of my eye. There, just beyond the trees, was a small wooden sign. It wasn't big, but it was definitely there. At first, I thought it might be part of the trail, but when I turned my head to get a better look, I froze. The sign was covered in faded paint, but the words were still legible. "Are you lost?" I stared at the sign, my mind racing. There was a number to call beneath the words, but I couldn't quite bring myself to reach for my phone. It was then that the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was lost. I didn't know where I was. And worse, I had no idea how to get back to the trail or the parking lot. The signs were supposed to help guide people, but I'd completely missed that one earlier. I pulled out my phone, still hoping to convince myself I could figure this out on my own. But when I unlocked the screen, I was stunned to see I actually had reception. The area I was in didn't usually get signal, which made me think I'd lucked out somehow. Maybe this was a sign, or maybe the universe just had a sick sense of humor. I dialed the number on the sign, trying to stay calm. A voice picked up on the other end, and I was relieved to hear someone who knew what they were doing. I explained where I thought I was, though I wasn't sure how accurate I was, and they took down my details. They said they would send someone to get me, and I should try to stay put until help arrived. I thanked them, still in shock at how quickly the situation had escalated. By then, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and the light was starting to fade. That was when the real worry set in. The heat had been bad enough, but now I was starting to feel the chill that often comes when the sun goes down. I had to make sure I stayed warm and that I didn't fall asleep here. It wouldn't take much for me to drift off and miss the sounds of anyone coming to help. It was around 5:30 p.m. when I started to hear something crunching in the underbrush. I held my breath and listened, trying to make out the sound. It wasn't just the wind or a passing animal. Someone was definitely coming. It was a sound that didn't belong, but it was still a welcome one. The ranger and police finally arrived in a small clearing, headlights cutting through the fading light. I stood up, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief wash over me. The ranger introduced himself, and I explained the situation. He seemed calm but serious, telling me I'd made a wise choice in calling for help. He mentioned that only about 100 people take this trail every year, which made me realize just how far off the beaten path I really was. After they checked me over, making sure I wasn't severely dehydrated or injured, they led me to an ambulance waiting nearby. The relief was overwhelming. I'd made it and I was going to be okay. As I rode back to the main road, I thought about the experience. I was grateful for the help and embarrassed that I hadn't paid more attention to the details. I could have avoided all of this if I had just checked the weather, brought more water, and turned back when I felt unsure. From that day on, I made a promise to myself to never take the wilderness for granted again. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike. The sun was still high in the sky. The heat of the Phoenix Desert was beginning to wane as the late afternoon approached, and the trail was as crowded as always. This was one of the most popular trails in the park, known for its beautiful end, a box canyon with a seasonal waterfall and a year-round pool of water, a rare sight in the desert. I've been looking forward to this hike for weeks. The promise of something cool and serene at the end made me feel excited as I moved along the path. The first part of the trail wasn't too bad. It was a bit rocky, but nothing too strenuous. As I continued, I could hear the murmurs of other hikers around me, some chatting away, others quietly moving along, enjoying the scenery. The trail had a steady incline, and as I approached the final stretch, the crowd seemed to thin out. The canyon wasn't far now. The sound of the wind through the dry brush, the chirps of birds, and the occasional rustling of leaves was all I could hear as I walked alone, one foot after the other, my breath coming a bit faster from the moderate climb. I reached the end of the trail where it started to narrow even more. This part of the trail led into a box canyon, an area completely surrounded by steep canyon walls. It was narrow, tight, and at first glance, I could only see the faint trickle of water from the seasonal waterfall ahead. I stopped for a moment, looking at the water. The air smelled a bit like damp earth, a rare scent in the desert, and the sound of the waterfall was soft, a constant trickle, but peaceful. A few other hikers had already made it here, and they seemed to be enjoying the pool, some dipping their feet in while others sat by the edge. I didn't feel like staying too long. I knew the hike back would be long and the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. As I approached the pool, the rustling sound from deeper in the canyon caught my attention. I paused, thinking it was just the wind or maybe a bird, but something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was that deep, instinctive feeling, the one you can't explain but know when something is wrong. I peered into the brush, scanning the area. It was still for a moment, and then I saw her, just a flash of movement, a flicker of something. I froze, my eyes locking onto the shape of a mountain lion. She was standing there, just outside the edge of the trees, staring directly at me. Her coat was a soft tawny color, blending with the dry ground, but her eyes, those golden eyes, locked onto mine and didn't look away. My breath caught in my throat. For a few seconds, all I could do was stare back at her. I could feel my heart rate increasing, the adrenaline surging, and I knew that this was no ordinary encounter. This was a predator and I was prey. I knew that. In the silence, the canyon seemed to grow even quieter. The other hikers, oblivious to what was unfolding just beyond them, continued talking, laughing, or taking pictures. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the lion. She didn't move at first, just watched me. Her posture was tense, like she was weighing her options. Her body was low, almost crouched, but not quite. Her tail flicked slightly, her muscles rippling under her coat as if she were ready to spring. Yet she held still. I knew the rules. I'd read about encounters with mountain lions before. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Make yourself look bigger. Speak calmly but assertively. But in that moment, all of that advice left my brain. The only thing I could think was that I needed to get out of there. Fast. I didn't know what to do. It was a box canyon, which meant there was no escape route other than the trail I had just walked down. The same trail that led directly back to where the lion was standing. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't outrun her. I couldn't outsmart her. All I could do was run, hope I made it, and pray that she didn't decide I was too easy of a target. Without thinking, I turned around and started running. I didn't stop to glance back, didn't take a second to check if she was following me. I just ran. The gravel and dirt crunched under my boots as my legs pumped hard, desperate to put distance between me and the mountain lion. I knew this wasn't the right thing to do. I'd read it, I'd been told it, but in that moment, fear had taken over. All I could focus on was getting back to the safety of the wider part of the trail, out of the narrow canyon, and away from her. My lungs burned, but I didn't care. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me. I ran faster, but I kept my senses alert. I didn't know if she was behind me, but I couldn't stop. I could feel the weight of the decision I'd made, each step feeling heavier than the last. I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat hammering in my ears, but there was no sound from behind me, no crunch of paws on the dry earth, no growl or low hiss, just my frantic movement as I pushed harder, faster, through the canyon. The trail was steep, rocky, and narrow, but I didn't care. I just had to make it to the wider area where the other hikers were. Maybe I could get help. Maybe I could find someone who knew what to do. I pushed past a few boulders, the sharp rocks scraping my hands and legs as I stumbled. But I didn't slow down. The world around me seemed to blur as I made my way back down the path, weaving through the rocks. The trail was a blur of jagged edges and sudden turns, but I didn't care. The thought of her, the mountain lion, still burned in my mind. What if she was following me? What if she was going to attack? Finally, I rounded the bend and the canyon started to open up. I was nearly out of the narrow, constricting passage. My pace began to slow, but I didn't stop. The trail was wider now, less claustrophobic. I could hear the distant chatter of other hikers, the sound of a group gathered at the waterfall. I could see them now, their voices, the laughter, all of it reminded me that I was close to safety. I didn't stop until I reached the wider part of the trail, and even then, I didn't look back. I slowed to a walk, my body trembling from the adrenaline. My legs were like jelly, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breath. I didn't know what I would have done if the lion had decided to follow me. I didn't want to think about it. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I found myself surrounded by a group of hikers who were still chatting, unaware of the danger I had just faced. I stood there for a while, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I didn't want to scare them, But I also didn't know how to explain what had just happened. How could I explain that I had just come face to face with one of the most dangerous predators in North America and had barely escaped? I kept walking, my mind racing, my body still in a state of shock. The hike back felt longer than the hike in, every step heavy, every sound making me tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing. No sign of her, no sounds of paws following me. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional chatter of hikers on the trail. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The parking lot was almost empty now, with just a few cars left. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the fear was starting to wear off, replaced by a strange sense of relief. I'd made it. I had survived. I knew I had done everything wrong in that moment. I had run when I shouldn't have. I had let fear control me, but somehow I had made it out okay. There were no signs of the lion, no sound of her stalking me from behind. I'd gotten away. As I drove home, the adrenaline finally started to fade, and I was left with the unsettling feeling that I had just come too close to something that could have ended much differently. I couldn't shake the image of her eyes, the way she had just stared at me, waiting. I couldn't forget the way my heart had raced as I turned around and ran, knowing that I had done exactly what you're not supposed to do. But in the end, it didn't matter. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. It had been a long day of hiking. The Appalachian Trail, like it always did, had tested my endurance with its seemingly endless switchbacks and relentless ups and downs. I was section hiking through an area known for its black bears, which always added a layer of unease to the experience, but I loved it nonetheless. Nature in its purest form, no distractions, just the rhythm of the trail and the sound of the wind through the trees. I had pushed a few extra miles past my original destination for the night, figuring I could make it to a campground further along the trail. I wasn't in a rush, but I liked the idea of having a solid, designated site where I wouldn't have to worry about finding a good spot to set up. By the time I arrived at the campground, it was starting to get dark, and I had barely enough energy to do anything other than set up camp and get ready for bed. The ranger at the entrance booth, an older guy with graying hair and a thick beard, gave me the usual spiel about checking in, making sure my food was properly secured, and not leaving anything out overnight. He also mentioned there had been more bear sightings than usual around that area. Apparently, a fallen apple tree nearby had drawn the bears in, and there had been some issues with people leaving food at campsites, making it worse. He advised me to be extra cautious. I filled out my site tag and made my way down the trail to where the campsites were located. As I was walking through the trees, I spotted a couple of black bears in the distance. They were rooting around in the underbrush, not paying me any attention, but I still couldn't help but feel a bit of tension rise in my chest. The ranger had mentioned the apple tree, and I thought about that as I made my way to my designated site. At least they seemed to be far enough off, but I couldn't help but wonder if they'd be around later. I set up my hammock near the edge of the site, with a good view of the forest and the trail behind me. I always preferred sleeping in my hammock, despite the risks. It was just more comfortable for me than a tent, even though I had to be more careful about keeping my food in the bear box. Once my hammock was up, I hung my food bag high, double-checked everything, and decided to take a few moments to relax before heading to bed. I sat down, pulling out a book and letting the cool evening air wash over me. As the evening grew darker, I slowly started to nod off, the quiet hum of the forest lulling me into a sense of calm. I had no idea how long I had been asleep when I was suddenly woken by the sound of something moving underneath my hammock. It was heavy, thudding footsteps that shook the ground beneath me. I held my breath, my heart racing, trying to figure out what was happening. It was the kind of feeling that made you instantly aware of every sound, every small shift in the air around you. For a long moment, I lay still, just listening. The animal moved around, stepping carefully through the leaves and dirt, and then, almost as if it had stopped right under me, it froze. My mind was racing. The first thought that popped into my head was that it had to be a bear. A black bear. I had read enough stories, heard enough warnings, to know that bears could be incredibly curious and fearless when it came to food. I had made sure to store my food properly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be about to become a bear burrito. I held my breath, trying to keep still, not daring to make a sound. I remembered the ranger's words about the bears. They were getting more aggressive due to food sources being too readily available. I could already feel my stomach sinking. Was it the smell of something I missed? I mentally ran through every step of my setup, hoping I hadn't made a mistake, hoping that the bear would just lose interest and move along. Minutes passed, and the weight of the situation began to feel unbearable. The animal under me hadn't moved at all. I strained my ears, listening intently. Then, through the dark, I could just make out the shape of its head. It wasn't the round, dark shape of a bear, but something thinner, a deer, a doe standing frozen beneath me. I let out a long exhale, not even realizing how tense I had been until the relief hit me. It wasn't a bear, but the experience had rattled me. I had no idea how long it had been under there, but eventually, the deer slowly backed away, its hooves softly tapping on the ground as it wandered off into the trees. I remained still for a while longer, just to make sure it was truly gone, before I finally allowed myself to relax. The night went on without incident, and I eventually fell back to sleep, but the experience lingered in my mind. It was the closest I had come to a full-on panic in a long time. The next morning, I was up early, eager to continue my hike and put the previous night behind me. The sun had barely crested over the horizon, and the campground was still quiet. I packed up my gear, double-checking that I had everything. As I was preparing to leave, I glanced back towards the area where the bears had been the day before. It was still and empty now, but the memory of the animals, of the fear, stuck with me. I hiked for a few days before my next unsettling encounter. I had met up with a friend for this part of the hike. He was a combat veteran, a tough guy, someone who wasn't easily rattled. We had been pushing ourselves, trying to make an extra long day out of it, when we passed a park with a Civil War memorial and a picnic shelter. The usual hikers were there, having breakfast or taking a break, but we kept going, wanting to get as much distance as possible. It was a beautiful stretch of trail, but then, not long after we passed the picnic shelter, we began hearing a strange sound. It was loud, almost like a moan, but it didn't quite sound human. The kind of moan you might hear from an injured animal, but much deeper, much more unsettling. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was close enough. It was coming from somewhere off the trail in the thick of the forest, just beyond where we could see. My first instinct was to check if someone was hurt. We were far enough out that it wouldn't have been unusual to find someone who had gotten injured, especially on a long stretch of trail like this. But then, as the noise continued, I saw the look on my friend's face. He was quiet, and for a moment he looked like he had seen a ghost. I didn't ask him anything. He didn't need to say it. He had been in combat situations and he had seen a lot of terrible things, but whatever that sound was, it had shaken him. "That's not human," he said finally, his voice low and tense. We kept walking, hoping it was just some animal we hadn't yet seen, but the noise followed us. It didn't seem to get closer, but it didn't fade away either. It was constant, haunting, like something trapped in the woods with us. We hiked on in silence, both of us too uneasy to speak. The sound continued for several more miles, fading in and out as we made our way along the trail, but we couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere behind us, echoing in the distance. By the time we reached camp that night, neither of us had said anything more about it. We made dinner in silence, both of us stealing glances at the trees, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that we weren't alone. My friend never admitted it, but I could tell that whatever had made that sound had left him on edge. We both knew it wasn't just an animal, and we were left with the lingering question of what it had been. The next day, we decided to keep moving, heading further along the trail. We made it through the rest of our hike without incident, but the moaning sound stayed with me. We never figured out what it was. My best guess is that it was a dying animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. Something big, something that could make a noise like that, but we'll never know for sure. We never heard it again, and eventually the tension faded, replaced by the usual rhythm of the trail. But that noise, it will stay with me. It was the kind of sound that you can't unhear, one that seeps into your bones and lingers long after the moment has passed. And in a way, it served as a reminder. No matter how familiar you become with the trail, there are always moments when you're reminded that you're just another animal in the woods, at the mercy of the land, the creatures that roam it, and the sounds that make you question what you know about the world around you. I've always prided myself on being a decent hiker, and I've spent countless hours on trails, exploring woods, and crossing mountains. I've learned a lot through the years, especially from my mistakes, and it's those mistakes that have stuck with me the longest. This story, however, is one of those lessons I'll never forget, and I learned it the hard way. The day started off normal enough. I had already done a good hike earlier in the morning, about a 5-mile stretch that went up into the hills and along a ridge. It was a great trail with sweeping views of the valley below, the kind of place where you could sit and lose yourself in the landscape. But that morning was a warm one, and by the time I finished my hike and got back to my camp, I was drained. The sun was high, and the air was thick with heat. I was sweating, my legs sore, and I wanted nothing more than to just lie down and rest for the rest of the afternoon. But after setting up camp and grabbing a quick snack, I felt a strange kind of restlessness. Something in me kept whispering to go out again. Maybe it was the thrill of the outdoors. Maybe it was just boredom. But I convinced myself that I could take a short, easy evening hike, something to stretch my legs and shake off the tiredness. I should have known better, but I figured it would be fine. It wasn't like I was doing anything too crazy. Just a quick 10-mile loop to get some fresh air, enjoy the landscape, and come back before nightfall. I packed a water bottle, some snacks, and my phone in case anything went wrong. It wasn't the first time I'd gone off-trail in search of something interesting. The plan was simple enough. Start on a nearby trail, and then cut across a few open areas to join another trail that would loop back to camp. The route wasn't marked on the map, but I had a rough idea of where it would take me. What I didn't realize was how much I had underestimated the terrain. I set off at about 4 p.m. The air had cooled a bit, and the shadows of the trees stretched longer as I hiked out of camp. I made my way through the woods, feeling the familiar crunch of gravel under my boots. At first, it felt good to be moving, to be away from camp and back into the solitude of the forest. I was feeling energized, even though I had already done a significant hike earlier that day. I figured this would be just a leisurely walk, nothing too demanding. As I made my way further from camp, the trail started to narrow, winding through dense brush. I was aware that I was leaving the main trail behind, but I wasn't concerned. The forest here wasn't particularly thick, and the ground was relatively clear. I could see the trail I wanted to join in the distance, and I thought cutting through this patch of woods would be quicker than continuing on the main route. It was then that I made my first mistake. I didn't pay attention to how steep the hill was in front of me. I had just seen a slight rise ahead and thought nothing of it, too focused on my goal to see the danger right in front of me. There was no marked path, no sign to indicate this was a difficult climb, so I just charged ahead. It wasn't long before I was struggling. The slope grew steeper as I pushed through the underbrush, my feet slipping on loose rocks and dirt. My legs, which had already been tired from earlier, started to feel like lead. The air, once warm and pleasant, began to feel heavier, pressing in on me as I climbed higher. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and grab at my feet. After what felt like forever, I stopped, breathing heavily, my legs aching. I was at the top of the hill, but now I was realizing just how foolish I had been. I hadn't really thought through what would happen when I reached the top. There was no easy way down from here, no trail that would lead me back. All I could see were more trees and a few rocky outcroppings. The trail I thought I was cutting through was nowhere to be seen. At that point, panic set in. I wasn't entirely lost, but I didn't know how to get back to the main trail. The fading light made everything look different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gone much farther than I intended. My stomach turned as I realized how tired I was. I could barely stand, let alone figure out how to get back down the other side of this hill. I decided to rest for a bit, sit down, and drink some water. I had made it this far, so I figured I could just wait until it got darker and try to figure it out then. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the light continued to fade. I wasn't any closer to finding my way back to the trail, and I was getting more and more exhausted. I kept telling myself I could make it, that it wasn't that bad, but my body was telling me otherwise. It was getting darker now, and I had no real plan. I was too tired to climb back down the hill the way I came, so I decided to sleep where I was. I didn't have much choice. There was no way I could make it back down the hill in the dark, not without risking injury. I spread out my jacket on the ground and curled up, my body aching from the day's hikes and the climb I had just made. The sounds of the forest started to shift as night settled in. The rustling of small animals in the brush, the distant hoot of an owl, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful in a way, but also unnerving. The darkness felt deeper, more oppressive out here in the wild, and I started to feel that gnawing fear that maybe I had pushed myself too far. As I lay there, trying to settle into the uncomfortable position on the hard ground, I thought about the trail I should have stayed on. I thought about camp, how warm and safe it felt. The reality of my situation hit me harder the longer I stayed there. I was alone, with no clear path back, and I had no idea what I was doing. I must have dozed off at some point because when I woke up, it was dark, full dark, no moon, just the faintest trace of light from the stars above. My first instinct was to get up and move, but my body refused to cooperate. I was drained, and no amount of willpower was going to make me feel less tired. I had to make a decision. I could stay here, spend the night, and try again in the morning, or risk moving through the darkness with the very real chance of getting lost or hurt. I stayed put. It was one of the hardest decisions I made that night, but I knew I wasn't in any condition to go wandering in the dark. The cold crept in as the hours ticked by, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to keep warm. It was a miserable night, but as I lay there, I knew that I had learned something important. I had made a poor choice, but it was also an opportunity to reflect on the importance of preparation, of knowing when to turn back, and of not letting ego drive decisions. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a sense of relief. The darkness of the night had been unnerving, but the new day brought with it clarity. I knew the path down the hill would be difficult, but I was sure that I could make it. I slowly rose to my feet, sore and stiff from my restless sleep. The world was quiet and still around me, and for a moment, I just stood there, soaking in the peace. I started back down the hill more carefully this time, picking my way through the rocks and trees. The steep incline felt even worse now that I was moving downhill. My knees screamed in protest with every step, and I had to stop frequently to rest. The thought of getting back to the trail kept me moving, though, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally made it to the bottom. From there, I found the trail I had originally planned to join. It wasn't far, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I stepped onto familiar ground. The woods, which had felt so ominous the night before, now seemed inviting. I was exhausted, but I had learned the most important lesson of all: humility. I had underestimated the terrain, overestimated my energy, and let my desire to explore take me too far. When I finally made it back to camp, the sun was fully up, and the warmth of the morning was a welcome relief. I took a deep breath, sitting on a rock and letting the weight of the experience settle in. I had made it back safely, but not without a price. My pride was bruised, but my mind was clearer than ever. From that day on, I promised myself I would never again push beyond my limits without considering the consequences. I learned to respect the land more, to understand that no hike was ever as simple as it seemed. And most of all, I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is admit when you're not in control and make the smarter decision, even if it means turning back. It was a lesson I'll never forget. It was one of those bitter January mornings in Saskatchewan, the kind where the cold claws at your skin, and the sky is a dull, unbroken gray, stretching out endlessly. The kind of cold that creeps deep into your bones, gnawing at you no matter how many layers you have on. I was out there alone, hiking a trail through the bush, the kind of place where the trees close in around you, and the silence is so thick it feels like the world is holding its breath. I had a rifle with me, something for protection. There were wolves in these woods, and you never know what other creatures might be lurking. The snow crunched beneath my boots with every step I took, and the air had a sharp, clean smell, like the world was frozen in time. I wasn't planning on going too far, just a quick hike to get my legs moving. My mind was restless, and a few hours in the quiet wilderness would do me good. As I walked, the trees seemed to press in closer, casting long, cold shadows on the snow-covered ground. I had the trail mostly to myself, with no sign of human footprints for miles. It was just me and the bush, which felt both comforting and isolating at the same time. I had rounded a corner, the path narrowing slightly, when I saw it. My breath caught in my throat as I came to an abrupt halt. Not more than 5 feet in front of me was a moose. Its massive body blocked the trail, standing perfectly still. Its dark, deep eyes stared at me, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to freeze. The moose was a giant, its fur dark and matted, the size of a small mountain, and it stood tall and silent, like it had been waiting for me to show up. Its nostrils flared, and I could see its breath, rising in a puff of white smoke into the cold air. The weight of the rifle in my hands suddenly felt much heavier, and my fingers tightened around the grip. My first instinct was to raise it, aim, and fire, but then something held me back. I wasn't just facing a large animal. I was facing a creature that could crush me in an instant if it wanted to. The moose didn't seem aggressive, but I knew how unpredictable wildlife could be, especially when surprised. And it wasn't just the moose that I had to consider, it was the consequences of my next move. I slowly raised the rifle, leveling it at the moose's head. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and for a brief moment, all I could hear was the sound of my breath in the cold air. The wind had died down, and the silence around us felt heavy. The snow lay undisturbed on the ground, and I felt like I was trapped in a moment, suspended in time. My finger rested on the trigger, but I couldn't bring myself to squeeze it. I knew that if I fired, if I missed, if that bullet didn't find its mark and drop the moose instantly, I would be dead. I was completely alone, miles from any help, and there was no room for error. A moose was not something you wanted to mess with. Could run faster than I could think, its hoofs sharp and strong enough to break bones. If I didn't kill it outright, it could charge me and I wouldn't stand a chance. The reality of the situation crashed down on me. This wasn't some hypothetical scenario where I was just a hunter on a hunt. This was life or death, and the decision was mine to make. I glanced quickly around me. The trail was narrow, the trees too close to give me any good cover. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, didn't want to provoke the moose in any way. It stood there, its large frame unmoving, its eyes locked on mine, but there was something in its gaze that wasn't hostile. It was almost curious. Maybe it was as unsure about me as I was about it. The seconds stretched on, feeling like minutes. My mind raced through 100 different scenarios, all of them ending badly. If I pulled the trigger, the noise would echo through the woods, and there was no guarantee the moose would drop. And even if it did, I'd have to deal with the aftermath, blood, the smell, and the noise drawing other creatures in. I didn't know what other predators were out here, but the last thing I wanted was to attract them. I lowered the rifle slightly, my arms beginning to tremble from the weight. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me, the adrenaline making my muscles stiff and weak at the same time. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, visible in the cold air. I knew I had to make a choice, either fire or back away. If I fired and missed, I might end up in a fight I couldn't win. If I backed away, I'd have to leave the trail and make my way through the woods, potentially getting lost or trapped in a different way. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of the situation. The moose hadn't moved. It wasn't showing signs of aggression, yet. It was just standing there, staring at me, and I realized that I didn't want to kill it. I didn't want to add to the violence in the world. The rifle felt wrong in my hands now, its presence a reminder of the danger that lay in every decision. I took a deep breath and, slowly, lowered the rifle even more until it hung at my side. I didn't take my eyes off the moose as I began to back away, step by slow step. My boots made no sound in the snow, and the air was still. I moved cautiously, careful not to make any sudden moves that might startle the animal. The last thing I wanted was for the moose to feel threatened and charge. Every step I took felt like it lasted a lifetime. I kept my gaze on the moose, watching its every movement, watching for any change in its demeanor. But it didn't move. It didn't charge. It just stood there, watching me, almost as if it were letting me go. After what felt like an eternity, I was far enough away that I felt safe. The moose was still standing there, unmoving. I didn't take my eyes off it until I rounded the corner, out of sight. Once I was out of its line of sight, I didn't look back. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but I had made it. I had survived the encounter. And as I walked back down the trail, the silence of the woods returned, but it felt different now. The danger was gone, and the air seemed a little less cold. I never finished that hike. The route I had planned to take no longer seemed important. I didn't want to risk another encounter, especially with something as unpredictable as a moose. I turned around and started back the way I came, retracing my steps, the weight of the rifle still heavy in my hands, but now feeling less like a tool of survival and more like a reminder of how close I had come to disaster. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I didn't see anything else that could threaten me. The trail was quiet, peaceful almost, and I could hear the distant sound of birds in the trees. But I kept thinking about the moose, about how close I had come to making a decision that would have changed everything. I could still see its eyes in my mind, still feel the weight of that moment where time seemed to stretch out, endless and terrifying. It wasn't just the moose that I had been afraid of. It was the realization that I was alone in the wilderness, and a single mistake could have been my last. When I finally reached my car, I didn't feel victorious or proud. I just felt relieved. I put the rifle back in its case and took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the heater in the car and the normal sounds of the world outside. I hadn't finished the hike I had set out to do, but I had made it out of the bush safely. Sometimes that's enough. It had been a beautiful hike up into the Cascades that morning. The sun was still low in the sky, its warm glow slowly creeping over the mountain ridges, catching the tips of the trees and the mist that clung to the deep valleys. The air was crisp, the kind that made you feel like your lungs were being washed out clean with every breath. The trail, which started as a rough but manageable path, wound its way up through thick trees, the kind of forest that was quiet in that deep way, like the mountains were holding their breath. I'd been on that trail before, but this time it felt different. It was early fall and the colors were just starting to change, making the foliage look like an artist had come through and painted everything with brush strokes of yellow, orange, and red. I had the whole trail to myself, which felt kind of like a gift. I was about 2 or 3 miles in when things started to get quiet, the kind of quiet where you realize there's no sound at all. No birds, no wind, nothing. It's funny how the quiet can feel so heavy, but that's exactly how it felt. I wasn't thinking too hard about it at the time. I was just focused on the trail, breathing in that sharp mountain air, thinking I should get to the overlook by noon and maybe have lunch there. It wasn't until I rounded a bend and saw the trail ahead of me that something felt off. It didn't look right. I stopped, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The trail just stopped. No warning, no sign, just a gap in the dirt where the path had been washed away. It wasn't some minor erosion. The trail had completely collapsed, leaving nothing but the steep slope of the ravine below and a fast-moving stream cutting its way through the canyon below. My first thought was that maybe there was a detour. I had seen those before on mountain trails. I figured I just missed the sign, but after looking around and seeing nothing, I realized the detour wasn't coming. The trail was gone. The stream below was loud. The sound of rushing water was enough to mask all other noise, making the whole situation feel even more isolated. I peered down into the ravine. The water wasn't deep, but it was moving fast, and the rocks below were slick with moss and algae, making the whole thing look like a place no sane person would try to cross. And yet, there was the trail on the far side of the river, still visible through the trees. It was like a line drawn in the sand, a reminder of where I should be but couldn't reach. The other side was still reachable, just a little ways downstream, but the question was, how? It hit me then, just how close I was to making a very bad decision. I stood there for a while, staring at the stream. The rocks on either side of the ravine weren't that far apart, maybe 50 feet. It didn't seem impossible. I could scramble down the side of the ravine, jump into the stream, wade across, and then climb up the other side. It wouldn't be pretty, but it seemed doable. At least it did in that moment. I began to picture myself doing it. I was already mentally planning the moves, calculating the risks, when something in the back of my mind snapped into place. I paused, that quiet voice of reason finally breaking through my adrenaline-fueled thoughts. "What are you doing?" it asked. I almost ignored it at first. It was so tempting to just follow through, to keep going, to finish the hike like I had planned. I could hear the sound of the waterfall on the other side, distant but inviting. I could almost taste the view from the top, the sense of accomplishment that would come once I was back on the trail. But that voice didn't go away. Stupid Texan dies in the outskirts of Olympic National Park. I thought to myself, and the thought of it hit me harder than I expected. It was like a slap in the face. The voice of reason wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a loud, undeniable truth. What if I slipped on the rocks? What if I misjudged the current, fell in, and got swept downstream? I could be miles from help, stuck in the wilderness with nothing but a few basic supplies in my pack. No one around for miles and no way to call for help. That's when it hit me. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have to do this. It wasn't some life or death situation. I was in a place where I could make the smart decision. And yet here I was, about to ignore the little voice in my head telling me to turn back. I had been hiking long enough to know that when a situation didn't feel right, it usually wasn't. I took a deep breath and stepped back from the edge. Slowly, carefully, I turned around. The sound of the stream seemed to grow quieter behind me as I walked, and the tension in my chest loosened just a little with each step. The trail was still there, winding back through the trees, and I followed it without looking back, thankful for the decision I had just made. The hike back wasn't as easy as the hike up. As I descended, I started thinking about the hike, about how close I had come to making that dangerous decision. I thought about how, if something had gone wrong, no one would have even known where to look for me. I didn't tell anyone where I was going or when I would be back. I had just left that morning with the thought of a quiet, peaceful hike in the mountains. But now, looking back, it felt reckless. Like I had been willing to ignore all the lessons I'd learned in the wilderness. Lessons that told me to respect the land, respect the risks, and respect my own limitations. It wasn't until I got back to my truck, safe and sound, that I realized just how dumb I had been. I hadn't even been in a real dangerous spot yet. All I had done was stand there and look at a washed-out trail, thinking that I could be reckless just this once, and that nothing would go wrong. But that's not how the wilderness works. It's not about taking risks when you don't have to. It's about respecting the place, knowing when to push forward and when to turn around. That's the thing about hiking in places like the Cascades or any wilderness, really. It's easy to get caught up in the thrill of it, the idea that you're some lone adventurer in a beautiful, wild place. But the truth is, the wilderness doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care if you're looking for adventure or just trying to check something off your bucket list. If you don't respect it, it will remind you, and often in ways that you don't want to experience. It's not that I wasn't capable. I've been in tougher situations and I've made it out just fine. I've climbed peaks, crossed rivers, and hiked through storms, but every time I did, I was aware of the risks. I was making calculated decisions. That moment, when I almost took a leap of faith without thinking, made me realize how close I had come to turning a simple hike into something tragic. I had the rest of the day to think it over, the quiet drive back to town giving me plenty of time to let the weight of the decision sink in. I thought about the moments when I had ignored that little voice in my head, when I had chosen to push through and ended up regretting it. And I thought about how, sometimes, the best decision you can make is the one where you turn around and walk away. It was a simple thing, really. I just had to turn around. But it felt like a victory. It was years ago now, but I still remember it clearly. It was a cool, crisp morning in western North Carolina, the kind of morning that made your breath cloud up in the cold air before it disappeared into the trees. My little Jack Russell pup, Buster, was trotting along beside me, his small legs moving faster than mine as usual, his nose twitching with every new scent in the air. He was a bundle of energy, and that was good, because it meant he'd keep moving and help keep my mind from wandering too far into thoughts about the quiet woods that surrounded us. We had camped the night before, in a small, secluded spot far off the trail, nestled deep in the woods. The kind of place where the only sounds you hear are the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional scurry of small animals. It had been an uneventful night, nothing but the usual sounds of nature, the crackle of the fire, and Buster curled up next to me in my sleeping bag. The kind of night I would have forgotten about if not for what happened next. I'd woken up early, just before dawn, the sky still dark with the promise of a sun that hadn't quite risen yet. I packed up camp in the near silence of the woods, careful to be quiet so I didn't disturb the peaceful morning. Buster had been eager to get moving, as he always was, so we set out just before 5 a.m., walking through the woods on our way back to the car. The trail was easy to follow, a well-worn path that snaked its way through thick stands of trees and dense underbrush. The woods felt alive, but in a way that only early mornings could capture. Quiet, still, but full of potential. I had about 4 miles left to go, not far at all. My car was parked near a trailhead that I had used to start the hike, and I was eager to get back. The air was still cool, but I could feel the warmth of the day slowly creeping in, the kind of warmth that makes you realize how much you've missed the sun when it's hidden behind the trees. We'd only been walking for about half a mile when everything changed. Out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out, so loud it felt like it had come from right beside me. It was so sharp, so sudden, that I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Buster, who had been trotting ahead of me, let out a high-pitched yelp, a noise I'd never heard from him before. He immediately spun around and bolted toward me, his small body shaking with panic. My instincts kicked in, and I spun around, flashing the beam of my headlamp in every direction, trying to locate the source of the sound. I couldn't make sense of it. The gunshot was so close it had to have been within 20 feet. There was no sign of movement in the trees, no other sounds, just the lingering echo of the shot, the sharp tang of gunpowder still hanging in the air. I felt a surge of panic, and I called out, my voice hoarse, "Hey, who's out there? Don't shoot." My words didn't seem to matter. No response, not even the faintest rustle in the leaves. The forest was still, unnervingly still. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, and the frantic patter of Buster's paws on the dirt as he circled me, trying to figure out what was going on. I thought about moving, about running back to the car, but I didn't know where the shot had come from, and I didn't want to make myself a target. I didn't even know if it was a hunter or someone just messing around, but the way Buster was reacting made it clear something wasn't right. He was shaking uncontrollably now, his little body pressed up against my legs as if seeking protection. I decided to stay put. I found a large tree nearby and crouched down, Buster close beside me, and we waited. I started shouting again, louder this time. "I'm not armed. I don't want any trouble. Please don't shoot." My voice cracked with fear, and each call felt more desperate than the last. I kept hoping, praying, that someone would respond, that I'd hear footsteps or the crackle of a twig underfoot, something to let me know that whoever had fired that shot wasn't just lying in wait. But there was nothing, no sound. The forest was completely silent, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. A gunshot this close was no accident. But who would be out here in the woods at this hour, let alone fire a gun in the direction of someone who was clearly alone? It didn't make sense, and the longer I sat there, the more I felt the weight of the uncertainty press down on me. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, or if I was just trying to convince myself I wasn't in real danger. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but no one came. The first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, turning the sky from a dark, velvet blue to a pale gray. The change in the light helped calm my nerves a bit, but it also brought with it a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had been hoping someone would show up, would walk down the trail toward me, maybe apologize for scaring me, explain that it was just a hunting accident or something. But no one came. I started to feel a deep unease, a sense that whoever had fired that shot wasn't interested in talking to me, and probably didn't care if I was still sitting under that tree, waiting. I glanced at my watch. It had been nearly an hour since the gunshot. The sun was rising higher now, and it was becoming clearer with each passing minute that I wasn't going to get any answers. I glanced at Buster, who was still trembling beside me. His usual confidence was gone. He was on edge, his little ears constantly twitching, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. It was then that I realized I had to make a choice. I could stay here, but I wasn't sure what that would accomplish. The woods had quieted down. The air no longer felt as oppressive, but there was still the nagging feeling that I was being watched. If I stayed much longer, I'd be sitting in the middle of a potential danger zone, waiting for someone who might never show themselves. The thought of that made my skin crawl. I didn't waste any more time. I got to my feet, keeping my flashlight on the ground, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention. Buster followed closely, still nervous, his head swiveling from side to side as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. The woods felt different now, as though they were no longer a place of quiet solitude, but rather a terrain of unknowns, each rustling leaf and snapping twig a potential threat. I walked slowly, carefully, but with purpose, trying to make my way back to the trailhead without rushing too much. Every now and then, I would stop and scan the area around me, looking for any sign of movement or anything out of place. I thought about the shot, about the person or people who might have fired it, and whether they were still nearby, whether they were watching me from behind a tree or waiting for me to slip up. The woods seemed endless, a tangled web of trees and undergrowth, and I was just one small, exposed figure walking through it. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the trailhead. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, but more than anything, I was relieved. As I neared the parking lot, I scanned the area one last time, half expecting to see someone standing by the car, maybe waiting for me. But there was no one. The car was parked where I had left it, the silence now broken by the sound of the engine as I started it up. As I drove away from the trailhead, the weight of the experience started to settle in. The fear that had been gnawing at me in the woods now turned into something else, something more unsettling. I couldn't explain what had happened, why I'd been targeted, or if it had even been a deliberate act. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't be hiking alone in those woods again. Not at that time of day, not in that place, not without being far more cautious. The woods were vast, and not everything in them was as peaceful as it seemed. The next time I went out, I'd be staying in my tent until the sun had fully risen, and even then I'd keep my guard up. It wasn't just the trees or the creatures I had to be wary of anymore. It was the people, too.